The courtroom fell silent as the handsome young man in the dark suit rose to address the jury, his charming smile never wavering, even as the prosecutor described in gruesome detail how he had bludgeoned a sleeping college student to death. Ted Bundy wasn't just defending himself against murder charges. He was performing, and he knew every eye in that Miami courtroom was fixed on him with a mixture of horror and fascination. What they didn't know yet was that the articulate law student standing before them had left a trail of bodies across at least 7 states, and the full scope of his crimes would shake America to its core. But how does a seemingly normal boy from a middle-class family transform into one of history's most prolific killers? What darkness lurked beneath that all-American facade? The answers would prove far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Theodore Robert Bundy entered the world on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. But his life began with a lie that would haunt him for decades. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22 and unmarried, a shameful situation for the era. To avoid the stigma of illegitimacy, Ted's grandparents made a decision that would warp the young boy's understanding of family and identity. They raised him as their own son, while his biological mother posed as his older sister. For years, young Ted believed his grandparents were his parents, his mother was his sister, and his actual father remained a mystery that would never be solved with certainty. The deception might have remained intact, if not for a fateful day when Ted was a teenager. Some accounts suggest he discovered the truth through school records. Others claim a cousin taunted him with the revelation. Regardless of how it happened, learning that his entire childhood had been built on a foundation of lies devastated him. His mother eventually married Johnny Bundy, a military cook, and the family moved to Tacoma, Washington, where Ted took his stepfather's surname. But something fundamental had broken inside him. Friends and family would later recall subtle changes in his behavior during his teenage years, though none recognized them as warning signs of what was to come. Outwardly, Ted seemed to thrive. He was intelligent, attractive, and articulate. In high school, he earned good grades and was well liked by his peers. But beneath the surface, he struggled with feelings of inadequacy and a growing darkness he couldn't articulate even to himself. He began shoplifting, not because he needed the items, but because it gave him a sense of control and power. He would later describe these early thefts as practice, a way of testing his ability to deceive and manipulate others without getting caught. It was a game, and he was learning the rules. In 1966, Ted enrolled at the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese. It was here that he met Stephanie Brooks, a beautiful and sophisticated young woman from a wealthy California family. Ted fell hard for her, perhaps seeing in her the stability and legitimacy he'd always craved. But Stephanie, while initially attracted to Ted's charm and intelligence, ultimately saw him as directionless and immature. When she broke up with him in 1968, something inside Ted shattered. He would later claim this rejection was meaningless, but his actions told a different story. For years afterward, Stephanie would remain his obsession, the template against which he measured all women, and perhaps the prototype for his future victims. After the breakup, Ted dropped out of the University of Washington and drifted through various jobs and educational pursuits. He worked at a suicide hotline where he met Anne Rule, a former police officer turned crime writer who would later author one of the most comprehensive books about Ted's crimes. Their friendship seemed genuine. Anne found Ted thoughtful, compassionate, and dedicated to helping others. She had no inkling that her friend might be capable of violence, let alone murder. How could she? Ted was the kind of volunteer who stayed late, who listened patiently to desperate callers, who seemed genuinely invested in saving lives. But during this same period, something was changing in Ted. He enrolled at the University of Washington again, this time with renewed focus, and graduated with a degree in psychology in 1972. He seemed to be getting his life together. He became involved in politics, working for Republican candidates and building relationships with influential people who praised his work ethic and intelligence. He even rekindled his relationship with Stephanie Brooks, who was impressed by his transformation from the aimless boy she'd rejected into an ambitious and successful young man. But this reinvention wasn't about genuine growth. It was about revenge and validation. About proving to Stephanie and perhaps to himself that he was worthy. When he felt he had sufficiently won her back, he abruptly ended the relationship without explanation, leaving her confused and hurt. It was a calculated act of cruelty, payback for the rejection that had wounded his ego years earlier. What Stephanie didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that Ted had already begun killing. The exact moment Ted Bundy committed his first murder remains uncertain, shrouded in his own lies and manipulations. He gave different accounts to different people, sometimes claiming he didn't kill until 1974, other times hinting at earlier crimes. But investigators now believe he may have started as early as 1971. What we know for certain is that by January 1974, young women were disappearing from college campuses across Washington state at an alarming rate. The first confirmed disappearance was Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old psychology major at the University of Washington. On the night of January 31st, 1974, she went to bed in her basement room in a house she shared with several roommates. When her roommates checked on her the next morning after she failed to wake up for work, they found her bed empty but neatly made. Her nightgown was hanging in the closet and there was blood on her pillow and bed sheets. Linda had vanished without a trace, seemingly plucked from her bed while she slept. The case baffled investigators. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Nothing to suggest how someone could have abducted a woman from a house full of people without anyone hearing or seeing anything. But Linda's disappearance was just the beginning. Over the following months, more young women vanished across Washington and neighboring Oregon. Donna Gail Manson disappeared from Evergreen State College in March. Susan Rancourt vanished from Central Washington State College in April. Roberta Kathleen Parks disappeared from Oregon State University in May. Brenda Ball was last seen leaving a tavern in June. Jorgan Hawkins disappeared from the University of Washington campus in June. The victims all shared striking similarities. They were young, attractive college students with long, dark hair parted in the middle, much like Stephanie Brooks. But were these similarities mere coincidence? Or was someone deliberately selecting victims who fit a specific type? Law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest were beginning to connect the dots, but they had little to go on. There were no bodies, no witnesses, no substantial evidence. The disappearances seemed almost supernatural in their efficiency. How could someone abduct so many women without leaving a trace? The answer would later shock investigators with its simplicity and audacity. On July 14, 1974, that answer began to emerge. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon at Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular recreation area east of Seattle. Thousands of people were enjoying the sunshine, swimming, picnicking, and lounging on the beach. Among them was 23-year-old Janice Ott, who had ridden her bike to the park to sunbathe. At around noon, several witnesses saw her talking to a handsome young man with his arm in a sling. He asked for her help loading a sailboat onto his car, and Janice, being friendly and wanting to help someone who appeared injured, agreed. They walked off together toward the parking lot, and Janice was never seen alive again. Just a few hours later, around 4 in the afternoon, the same man approached 19-year-old Denise Naslund, who was at the park with her boyfriend and friends. When her boyfriend left to use the restroom and buy some food, Denise told her friends she was going to the bathroom. She never returned. Several witnesses later reported seeing her talking to a good-looking man with his arm in a sling, who introduced himself as Ted and asked for help with his sailboat. The Lake Sammamish abductions were different from the others in one crucial way. There were witnesses, and they all told the same story. A man named Ted driving a Volkswagen Beetle, wearing his arm in a sling, asking for help with a sailboat. Police released a composite sketch based on witness descriptions, and tips began pouring in. Multiple people, including Ted's girlfriend at the time, Elizabeth Klopfer, and Anne Rule, his friend from the suicide hotline, called the tip line to suggest Ted Bundy might be the man in the sketch. But Ted, charming, helpful, politically connected Ted, the man who worked at the suicide hotline, it seemed absurd. Police added his name to a list of hundreds of suspects, but gave it no special priority. Meanwhile, Ted was escalating. In the fall of 1974, he enrolled in law school at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, ostensibly to further his education and career. But his real education was in murder, and his curriculum was expanding to new territories. Shortly after his move to Utah, young women began disappearing there too. Nancy Wilcox vanished in October. Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a local police chief, disappeared later that month. Her body was found 9 days later in a canyon, and the autopsy revealed she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Laura Amey disappeared in October and was found a month later in a similar condition. Deborah Kent vanished from her high school in November. Ted's method had evolved from the crude arm-in-a-sling ruse. He sometimes impersonated police officers, using a fake badge to gain women's trust. He would approach them in parking lots, claiming there had been a theft or accident involving their car, and asking them to come with him to file a report. Other times, he would fake an injury or appear helpless in some way, exploiting women's natural inclination to help someone in need. Once he had them close to or inside his Volkswagen Beetle, he would strike, usually with a crowbar or pipe hidden in the car. He removed the passenger seat in his Beetle to create a space where he could subdue and hide his victims. But what did Ted do with these women once he had them? The details that would later emerge were so horrific that even hardened investigators struggled to process them. Ted didn't simply kill his victims quickly, he transported them to remote locations where he could spend time with them, assaulting them, torturing them, and savoring their fear. He often kept them alive for hours or even days. After murdering them, he would return to the dump sites repeatedly to engage in necrophilia, applying makeup to their decomposing corpses, washing their hair and posing them. He decapitated at least 12 of his victims, keeping some of their severed heads as souvenirs in his apartment. In November 1974, Carol Durant became the victim who got away, though her escape was purely accidental. A man claiming to be Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department approached her at a shopping mall, telling her someone had tried to break into her car. He asked her to come with him to the station to file a report. Confused but trusting the official-looking badge, Carol agreed. But when he drove past the police station and pulled into a dark side street, she realized something was wrong. When he tried to handcuff her, she fought back with everything she had. She managed to get the car door open and tumbled out onto the street. The man chased her, swinging a crowbar at her head, but she screamed and ran toward traffic. A passing car stopped and her attacker fled. Carol Durant had survived and she could identify her attacker. That same night, Deborah Kent disappeared from her high school a few miles away. Investigators would later find a small key in the school parking lot, a key that would prove significant in ways no one yet understood. As bodies began to turn up in the mountains of Utah and Colorado, a task force formed to hunt the killer. They had Carol Durant's description, they had evidence from the crime scenes, and they had a pattern. But they didn't have a suspect. Ted continued his killing spree with apparent impunity, expanding his hunting grounds to Colorado in January 1975. Corinne Campbell disappeared from a ski resort in Snowmass Village. Her body was found a month later, and the injuries were consistent with the other victims. Julie Cunningham vanished in March. Denise Oliverson disappeared in April. Lynette Culver was abducted in May. Shelley Robertson was killed in July. How did one man abduct and murder so many women without being caught? The answer lay partly in the interstate nature of his crimes. In the 1970s, communication between law enforcement agencies in different states was limited. There was no national database of serial killers, no shared information systems. Each jurisdiction investigated its own cases largely in isolation, not realizing they were all hunting the same predator. Ted exploited this lack of coordination brilliantly, committing crimes in one state and then fleeing to another before investigators could connect the dots. But Ted's luck was finally running out. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward was sitting in his patrol car in the early morning hours when a Volkswagen Beetle drove past, then suddenly accelerated when the driver noticed the police car. Hayward pursued and pulled the vehicle over in a suburban neighborhood. The driver was a clean-cut young man who seemed nervous. When Hayward searched the car, he found handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, wire, rope, and a ski mask. The passenger seat had been removed. The young man, who identified himself as Ted Bundy, claimed he'd simply gotten lost and panicked when he saw the police car. The items in his car were innocent, he explained. The handcuffs were for security purposes. The ice pick was for chipping ice. The rope and wire were for securing items. Hayward didn't buy it. He arrested Ted for possession of burglary tools and brought him in for questioning. When investigators started digging into Ted Bundy's background, the pieces began falling into place. His name had been on the suspect list for the Washington murders. He fit the description from Lake Sammamish. And Carol Durant, when shown a photo lineup, identified him as the man who had tried to abduct her. The key found at Deborah Kent's high school fit the handcuffs found in Ted's car. On March 1, 1976, Ted Bundy was convicted of aggravated kidnapping in the Carol Durant case and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But investigators were building much bigger cases against him. As Ted sat in the Utah State Prison, detectives from Colorado, Utah, and Washington were connecting his movements to dozens of unsolved murders and disappearances. They had a serial killer in custody, but proving the murders would require evidence, witnesses, and confessions. Ted, meanwhile, had no intention of making it easy for them. The saga took another dramatic turn when Colorado authorities obtained permission to bring Ted to Aspen to face murder charges in the Carrie Campbell case. During a preliminary hearing in June 1977, Ted, who was representing himself as his own attorney, asked to visit the courthouse law library. The deputies, perhaps charmed by the well-spoken law student, removed his handcuffs and leg shackles. During an unguarded moment, Ted jumped from a second-story window, injuring his ankle but successfully escaping into the mountains. For 6 days, Ted was free, and the manhunt made national headlines. How had such a dangerous criminal been allowed to escape? The public was riveted by the story of the handsome killer on the run. Ted survived in the mountains by breaking into cabins and stealing food and clothing, but with an injured ankle and no real plan, he didn't make it far. On June 13th, police caught him driving a stolen car erratically through Aspen. He was returned to custody, this time in a more secure facility. But Ted Bundy wasn't finished yet. On December 30th, 1977, he escaped again, this time more spectacularly. Over several months, he had acquired a hacksaw blade and used it to cut through the welding on a light fixture in his cell ceiling. He squeezed through the opening into the crawl space above, then worked his way through the jailer's apartment above the jail while the jailer and his wife slept. He stole the jailer's clothes and money, then walked out the front door of the jail. By the time authorities realized he was gone, Ted had a 15-hour head start. Ted stole a car and drove to Denver, where he caught a flight to Chicago, then another to Atlanta, and finally a bus to Tallahassee, Florida. He was free, in a state where investigators had no idea he existed, with a new identity and a chance to start over. But Ted Bundy couldn't start over because Ted Bundy couldn't stop killing. The darkness inside him wasn't satisfied. It demanded more. On January 14, 1978, just 2 weeks after his escape, Ted entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through a back door with a faulty lock. It was late at night and the young women inside were sleeping, unaware that a monster had entered their home. What happened next would become one of the most brutal crime scenes in American history. Over the course of approximately 15 minutes, Ted moved through the sorority house like a demon. He entered Margaret Bowman's room and bludgeoned her with a piece of firewood, then strangled her with her pantyhose. He moved to Lisa Levy's room and beat her unconscious, sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and bit deeply into her left buttock and nipple. He attacked Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler in another room, beating them both savagely with the log. Somehow, through the fog of their injuries, they survived. A sorority sister returning home late heard noises and saw a man leaving the house, but she didn't realize what had happened until she went inside and discovered the carnage. Less than an hour after the Chi Omega attacks, Ted struck again. Just 8 blocks away, he broke into the apartment of Cheryl Thomas, a Florida State dance major, and beat her so severely with a club that she suffered permanent deafness and a shattered jaw. By sheer luck, she survived. The attacks were so frenzied, so savage, that investigators initially wondered if they were dealing with multiple attackers. But the evidence told a different story. Bite marks on Lisa Levy's body, a pantyhose mask left at the scene, witness descriptions of a man fleeing the area, all pointed to a single perpetrator. But who? Ted had left behind his most substantial evidence yet, but authorities still didn't know they were hunting an escaped convict from Colorado. Ted, now living under the alias Chris Hagen in a rundown Tallahassee rooming house, tried to maintain a low profile, but the monster inside him wasn't finished. On February 9, 1978, he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. He sexually assaulted her, murdered her, and dumped her body in an abandoned pig shed. A fisherman would find her remains 2 months later. The abduction of Kimberly Leach would prove to be Ted's final crime. 3 days later, while driving a stolen Volkswagen Bug, he was pulled over by Pensacola police officer David Lee for a traffic violation. When Lee ran the license plate and discovered the car was stolen, he arrested the driver. The man gave his name as Kenneth Misner and seemed strangely agitated. At the police station, as officers began to suspect their prisoner wasn't who he claimed to be, Ted suddenly snapped. He tried to run, attacking officers and making a desperate bid for freedom. It took 3 officers to subdue him. When they finally confirmed his identity through fingerprints, the officers were stunned. They had captured Ted Bundy, one of America's most wanted fugitives. The charming, articulate man in custody was responsible for murders across at least 7 states. But Ted wasn't ready to confess. Instead, he would mount a defense that would captivate the nation and change the landscape of crime coverage forever. Ted's trial for the Chi Omega murders began on June 25, 1979, in Miami, and it was unlike anything America had seen before. It was the first nationally televised trial, and millions watched as Ted, serving as his own attorney with assistance from public defenders, performed for the cameras. He was intelligent, articulate, and seemingly calm. He cross-examined witnesses, argued legal points, and maintained his innocence with an air of wounded dignity. How could this man be a monster? Look at him, so composed, so rational, so normal. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him near the Chi Omega house on the night of the murders. The pantyhose mask found at the scene matched samples from Ted's rooming house. Most damning of all, forensic odontologists testified that the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body matched Ted's teeth perfectly. It was some of the first testimony of its kind in American legal history, and it was devastating. The testimony about Ted's crimes was graphic and horrifying. The medical examiner described in clinical detail the injuries inflicted on the victims, the brutality of the attacks, the evidence of sexual assault. Family members of the victims sat in the courtroom, weeping, forced to hear about their daughter's final moments. And through it all, Ted maintained his composure, sometimes even smiling, as if the proceedings were merely an intellectual exercise rather than a trial for savage murders. On July 24, 1979, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Ted delivered a rambling statement proclaiming his innocence and suggesting he was the victim of circumstantial evidence and overzealous prosecution. It fell on deaf ears. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced him to death, but not before delivering remarks that captured the tragic waste of Ted's life. "Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. It's a tragedy to this court to see such a total waste of humanity. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went the wrong way, partner. Take care of yourself." Ted was convicted again in February 1980 for the murder of Kimberly Leach and sentenced to death a second time. As he sat on death row at Florida State Prison, Ted began to open up about his crimes. Though his confessions were self-serving and manipulative, he never confessed to protect his victims or their families. He confessed as a bargaining chip, hoping to delay his execution. During the 1980s, Ted granted several interviews to investigators and journalists, including extensive conversations with FBI profilers and with authors writing books about his crimes. He spoke about his pornography addiction, claiming it had twisted his sexuality and led him down a dark path. He described his crimes in detached third-person language, as if discussing someone else's actions. He claimed to have used alcohol to quiet his inhibitions before attacks. But was any of this true, or was it simply another performance, another manipulation? The full body count remains unknown. Ted officially confessed to 30 murders, but investigators believe the actual number could be much higher, possibly over 100 victims. He dropped hints about other crimes, other victims, other locations, but never provided enough detail to confirm anything. Even in confession, he maintained control, doling out information strategically, always holding something back. It was a final exercise in manipulation, one last game where he held all the cards. What drove Ted Bundy to commit such horrific crimes? Psychologists, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts have debated this question for decades. Some point to his illegitimate birth and the deception about his parentage as the root trauma that fractured his psyche. Others focus on his rejection by Stephanie Brooks and his obsessive need for control and revenge. Many emphasize his complete lack of empathy and his tendency to view others as objects to be used for his gratification. Ted himself offered various explanations over the years, but none of them rang entirely true. He blamed pornography, alcohol, society's desensitization to violence, anything but taking full responsibility for his choices. Some experts believe he was a psychopath from birth, someone whose brain was fundamentally wired differently, incapable of true emotional connection or empathy. Others argue that while he may have had psychopathic tendencies, his environment and experiences shaped how those tendencies manifested. The reality is probably some combination of nature and nurture, biology and environment, inherent evil and learned behavior. But whatever the cause, the result was the same. Dozens of young women, full of promise and potential, their lives cut short by a man who saw them as nothing more than vehicles for his twisted desires. On January 24, 1989, after exhausting all appeals and last-minute legal maneuvers, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Hundreds of people gathered outside the prison to celebrate, holding signs that read, "Burn Bundy, burn," and cheering when officials announced the execution was complete. Inside the prison, Ted's final words were to his mother, whom he called the night before. He told her he loved her and asked her to give his belongings to his wife, Carol Ann Boone, whom he had married during his trial and who had borne him a daughter. The daughter he would never see grow up, the family he had created but could never truly be part of because of the monster he was. As the leather straps tightened around his wrists and ankles, as the metal cap was placed on his head, what did Ted Bundy think about? Did he see the faces of his victims? Did he feel any remorse? Or did he maintain his narcissistic belief that he was special, different, above the normal rules of society, even in those final moments? We'll never truly know because Ted took the truth to his grave, leaving behind only pain, questions, and a legacy that would haunt American consciousness for generations. Ted Bundy's impact on American culture and the criminal justice system cannot be overstated. He was one of the first serial killers to become a media sensation, his good looks and intelligence making him a fascinating subject for a public that couldn't reconcile his appearance with his crimes. The question, how could someone who looks like that do something like this, revealed society's naive belief that evil has a certain appearance, that monsters look like monsters. Ted proved that predators could wear any face, that charm and intelligence were tools of manipulation, not signs of inherent goodness. His crimes led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies communicate and coordinate across jurisdictions. The gaps in information sharing that had allowed Ted to kill for so long were addressed through the creation of national databases and improved interagency cooperation. His case contributed to the development of criminal profiling at the FBI, as agents studied his methods and psychology to better understand serial offenders. Ted's televised trial changed how Americans consumed crime stories, beginning a fascination with true crime that continues to this day. The trial proved that crime could be entertainment, that viewers would tune in to watch legal proceedings like they were dramatic performances. This shift has had profound implications for how justice is administered, how criminals are portrayed, and how victims are sometimes forgotten in the spectacle. The bite mark evidence that helped convict Ted became controversial in later years as forensic science advanced and revealed that bite mark analysis is far less reliable than once believed. While it helped secure justice for Ted's victims, the precedent it set led to wrongful convictions in other cases. The legacy of Ted Bundy touches even the science of forensics itself. His victims, though often forgotten in the sensationalism surrounding Ted himself, deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals. Each had dreams, families who loved them, futures that were stolen. Linda Ann Healy wanted to work in broadcasting. Donna Gale Manson was an artist. Susan Rancourt planned to teach. Jorgen Hawkins was studying to be a teacher. Margaret Bowman wanted to work in fashion. Lisa Levy hoped to become a lawyer. Kimberly Leach was just 12 years old, a child who had barely begun to live. So what can we learn from the horrifying story of Ted Bundy? That evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs, that charm and intelligence can mask the darkest intentions. That vigilance matters, that trusting our instincts when something feels wrong can save lives. that society must do better at protecting its vulnerable members, at teaching young people about manipulation and predatory behavior, at creating systems that don't allow killers to exploit jurisdictional gaps. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: Ted Bundy was not special. He was not a misunderstood genius or a tragic figure driven to violence by forces beyond his control. He was a predator who made choices, who decided that his desires were more important than other people's lives. He was a man who could have chosen differently at countless moments, but instead chose cruelty, violence, and death. Understanding that doesn't make his crimes less horrifying. It makes them more so because it reveals that the capacity for such evil exists within humanity itself, waiting for the right combination of circumstances, choices, and moral failures to emerge. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Let me know what you think about this case. Should there be more safeguards to prevent cases like this from happening again? How do we spot predators who hide in plain sight? Your thoughts matter, and this conversation is far from over. The story of Ted Bundy is a reminder that we live in a world where predators exist, where people we trust might harbor dark secrets, where the person sitting next to us on the bus or standing in line at the coffee shop could be capable of unspeakable acts. It's an uncomfortable truth, one that makes us want to believe in simple explanations and obvious warning signs. But the reality is more complex and more disturbing. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like Ted Bundy, smiling in a courtroom, charming a jury, playing the role of the wronged innocent, even as the evidence of his guilt surrounds him. And that's why we remember him, not to glorify his crimes or elevate him to some twisted form of celebrity, but to remind ourselves that the darkest capabilities of human nature must be recognized, understood, and guarded against. The victims of Ted Bundy deserved better from the systems meant to protect them, from the society that failed to see the warning signs, from a culture that sometimes seemed more interested in the killer than in those he killed. We honor them now by remembering their names, their dreams, their humanity, and by working to ensure that predators like Ted Bundy find it harder to hunt, harder to hide, and impossible to escape justice. If this story has affected you, if you found yourself drawn into the darkness of Ted Bundy's crimes and the tragic fates of his victims, take a moment to like this video and share it with others. Not because the story is entertaining, but because it's important. Because remembering these victims, understanding how such crimes happen, and learning how to prevent them matters. Justice for the victims of Ted Bundy came too late, but justice for future potential victims can come through awareness, education, and the determination never to let such evil go unchallenged again.